There is a sentence that stops most conversations cold. I do not talk to my family anymore. It does not matter how calmly it is said. It does not matter how much context surrounds it. The moment those words land, something shifts in the room. People do not just hear it, they feel it. And what they feel is almost always discomfort, because the decision to walk away from family violates one of the deepest unspoken agreements in human psychology. The agreement that blood is permanent, that family is beyond question, that no matter what happens behind closed doors, the bond itself is sacred and should never be the thing that breaks. So when someone breaks it, the world does not ask what happened. It asks what is wrong with them. It assumes bitterness. It assumes immaturity. It assumes an inability to forgive. It searches for the flaw in the person who left, rather than considering the possibility that leaving was not the flaw. It was the repair. This is not a story about people who gave up easily. It is not about dramatic exits or impulsive decisions made in anger. It is about what happens inside a human nervous system when the place that was supposed to be the safest becomes the most dangerous. And it is about the specific and largely invisible psychological labor involved in choosing yourself over a bond the entire world tells you should come before everything else. To understand why someone walks away from their family, you first have to dismantle the assumption that all families function as the word implies, because the word family carries an enormous amount of psychological weight. It implies safety. It implies unconditional acceptance. It implies a place where you are known, protected, and valued simply for existing. And for many people, that is exactly what family provides. But for others, the word and the reality never matched. The home was not safe. The love was not unconditional. The acceptance was contingent on compliance, silence, performance, or the willingness to absorb someone else's pain without ever naming your own. In these environments, the word family did not describe a relationship. It described an obligation, one that demanded loyalty regardless of how that loyalty was being repaid. And here's the part that makes this so psychologically complex. Children do not have the option to evaluate the environment they are born into. A child's brain is not equipped to say this is dysfunction. It is equipped to say this is normal. Whatever happens in the home during the first years of life becomes the template for what relationships are supposed to feel like. If love arrives alongside criticism, the child learns that love and criticism are the same thing. If affection is followed by withdrawal, the child learns that closeness is temporary and must be earned again and again. If a parent's mood determines the emotional weather of the entire household, the child learns that their job is to predict, manage, and absorb that weather in order to survive. These lessons do not stay in childhood. They move into the body. They become patterns. They shape how a person attaches, how they trust, how they interpret silence, and how much of themselves they are willing to sacrifice in order to maintain a bond that was supposed to sustain them, but instead required them to sustain it. And because these patterns form before language, before critical thinking, before the child has any framework for comparison, they do not register as learned behavior. They register as truth. The child does not think my family is dysfunctional. The child thinks this is how love works. And that conflation between dysfunction and love becomes the most dangerous inheritance a family can pass down. Because it means that when the child grows up and encounters genuine safety, genuine respect, genuine care without conditions, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels foreign. Sometimes it even feels suspicious. And the patterns that were installed in childhood keep pulling the adult back toward what is familiar, even when what is familiar is the thing that is causing the most damage. People who eventually walk away from their families almost never do so because of a single event. They do so because of accumulation, years of it, decades of it, a lifetime of moments that individually might seem survivable, but collectively create a weight the nervous system can no longer carry without breaking. It is the holiday dinner where the same humiliation is delivered in the same tone, and everyone laughs as if it is tradition. It is the phone call that leaves you drained for 3 days, but that you make every week because guilt is louder than exhaustion. It is the conversation you have had 400 times where you explain what hurt you, and the response is always the same: you are too sensitive. That never happened. You are remembering it wrong. This last pattern has a name in psychology. It is called invalidation. And when it is practiced consistently within a family system, it does something specific and devastating to the person on the receiving end. It teaches them to distrust their own experience, to doubt their own memory, to wonder whether the pain they feel is real or whether they manufactured it. Over time, this creates a psychological fracture. The body knows something is wrong. The mind has been trained to believe nothing is, and the person lives inside that gap, exhausted by a conflict between what they feel and what they have been told they should feel. Walking away, when it finally happens, is not the moment they stopped caring. It is the moment they stopped agreeing to disappear inside someone else's version of reality. It is the moment the body's truth finally became louder than the family's narrative. And that moment, while it may look sudden from the outside, is almost always the result of years of trying everything else first. There is often a final moment, not necessarily the worst thing that happened. Sometimes it is the smallest. A comment at dinner that on its own means nothing but in context means everything. A tone of voice that lands on a wound so old and so precisely targeted that the body simply says no more. Not with rage, not with theatrics, with a quietness that surprises even the person feeling it. Because the decision, when it finally arrives, does not feel like an explosion. It feels like an exhale. The release of something that has been held for so long that the muscles forgot they were holding it. This is the part that the outside world rarely sees. People who walk away from their families are not people who did not try. They are usually the ones who tried the hardest. They were the peacemakers, the translators, the emotional absorbers, the ones who adjusted themselves endlessly in hopes that if they could just find the right shape, the right tone, the right version of themselves, the family would finally work the way it was supposed to. They went to therapy. They read the books. They practiced the language. They approached conversations with carefully prepared words, hoping that this time the message would land differently. They gave second chances and third chances, and chances they lost count of, not because they were naive, but because the cost of giving up felt greater than the cost of continuing to try. They sat across from people who had hurt them and offered understanding instead of accusation. They made themselves vulnerable in rooms where vulnerability had historically been used against them. They chose the harder path again and again, because somewhere inside them lived the belief that if they could just find the right approach, the right words, the right combination of patience and honesty, the system would finally respond with the care they had been waiting for since childhood. And every time it did not, they didn't walk away. They adjusted. They tried harder. They absorbed the disappointment and returned with another attempt. And each time the effort failed, something small inside them eroded. Not hope exactly, something more structural than hope. the belief that their presence in the family mattered in the way they needed it to, the belief that they could be seen for who they actually were, rather than the role the system had assigned them, the belief that love, if it was real, would eventually respond to honesty with honesty, rather than meeting it with defense, denial, or punishment. By the time someone walks away, they are not leaving because they are angry. They are leaving because they are empty. The tank that held all the trying, all the translating, all the absorbing has been drained so many times that it no longer refills. And what remains is not resentment. It is clarity. The quiet, exhausted recognition that the relationship they have been fighting to preserve does not exist. What exists is a pattern, and the pattern requires their participation to continue. And they have decided, finally, that the cost of participating is higher than the cost of stopping. The decision to walk away from family does not end the relationship in the way that most people assume. It does not produce relief and then silence. It produces grief. And the grief is unlike any other because it mourns something that was never fully alive. This is the cruelty of it. You are not grieving the loss of a good relationship that ended. You are grieving the relationship you needed, but never received. The parent who should have protected you but did not. The sibling who should have stood beside you but chose the system instead. The home that should have been a place of rest, but was instead a place of vigilance. You are mourning the absence of something that was supposed to exist. And that kind of grief has no resolution because there is nothing to return to. There is only the slow and painful acceptance that what you needed was never available. Not because you did not deserve it, but because the people responsible for providing it were not capable of offering what they did not have. This grief does not follow a linear path. It arrives in waves. It shows up on holidays when the absence feels louder than the noise. It surfaces in small moments. A stranger's family laughing together at a restaurant, a friend casually mentioning their mother's advice, a form that asks for an emergency contact, and the pen hovers because there is no obvious answer. These moments do not destroy you, but they remind you. And each reminder carries the specific weight of a loss that the world does not have a ritual for, because the world knows how to mourn the dead. It doesn't know how to mourn the living. And when the people you have lost are still alive but no longer safe to be near, the grief becomes invisible, unwitnessed, carried entirely alone. There are no sympathy cards for the parent you had to stop calling, no bereavement leave for the family you had to leave in order to survive, no language that the people around you can reach for when they see the weight you carried during the holidays. So the grief lives in silence, not because it is small, but because the world has not yet built a container large enough to hold something this specific and this common at the same time. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who have walked away from their families. It is not the loneliness of having no one. Many of them have built chosen families, friendships, and partnerships that are deeper and more honest than anything their biological family provided. The loneliness is more specific than that. It is the loneliness of carrying a story that most people cannot hear without flinching. When someone says they do not speak to their family, the room does not open up with curiosity. It tightens. People become careful. They change the subject or offer advice that reveals how little they understand. Have you tried talking to them? Family is family. You only get one mother. Life is too short to hold grudges. These responses are not cruel in intention, but they are devastating in impact, because what they communicate beneath the words is that your experience is too uncomfortable for me to sit with, that whatever happened could not have been bad enough to justify this. That the problem is not the family. The problem is your inability to endure it gracefully. And that message, delivered by well-meaning people who have never had to make the choice you made, reinforces the very isolation that the family system originally created. Over time, many people who have walked away learn to manage this loneliness by managing disclosure. They learn who can hear their story and who cannot. They develop a shorthand for navigating questions about holidays, about parents, about childhood. They become skilled at redirecting conversations away from territory that will require them to either lie or explain something that most people are not equipped to receive. And this management, while effective, is itself a form of emotional labor. One more layer of translation in a life that has already required too much of it. But there is something else that lives alongside the grief and the loneliness. Something that rarely gets spoken about because it contradicts the narrative the world prefers. And that is the quiet, steady, hard-won experience of becoming whole. Because when you walk away from a family system that required you to be less than you are, something begins to happen that years of trying within the system never produced. You start to hear your own voice, not the voice that was trained to manage, to appease, to anticipate. Your actual voice, the one that knows what it feels and does not need permission to feel it. The one that can say no without guilt collapsing the sentence before it is finished. The one that can sit in silence without scanning the room for danger. This does not happen quickly. It does not happen cleanly. There are years of unlearning between the decision to leave and the experience of arriving in yourself. Years of catching old patterns still running in the background. Years of flinching at tones that no longer belong to anyone present. Years of discovering that the hypervigilance that kept you safe inside the family is still operating long after the threat has been removed. But slowly, with distance and often with support, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. The body learns that rest is not a trap. That silence is not a warning. That love does not have to be earned through performance or maintained through self-erasure. And in that recalibration, something emerges that was always there but never had room to exist. A self that was not shaped by the family's needs but by its own. And this self feels different from anything the old system produced. It is quieter, less reactive, less willing to abandon its own experience in order to make someone else comfortable. It can hold a boundary without crumbling under the guilt that used to follow. It can receive kindness without waiting for the cost to arrive. It can sit in a room and not scan every face for signs of what is about to go wrong. These changes do not erase the past, but they build something on top of it. A foundation that was never provided but was constructed by hand, one painful insight at a time, in the years after leaving. And that foundation, because it was built by the person standing on it, holds in a way that the original one never did. This is not a story about villains and victims. Families are systems, and systems operate according to patterns that often predate anyone currently living inside them. The parent who could not offer safety may not have received it themselves. The dysfunction that defined your childhood may have been inherited from a generation that never had the language or the resources to interrupt it. Understanding this does not erase what happened, but it can change the meaning of why you left. You did not leave because you were too weak to endure it. You left because you were the first person in the chain strong enough to say, "This stops with me." If you recognize yourself in this, there is nothing wrong with the choice you made. Walking away from family is not a failure of love. It is sometimes the most honest expression of it. The recognition that you cannot love someone well from inside a dynamic that is destroying you. That distance is not abandonment. It is the only condition under which some version of care can survive without self-destruction. And if you have never had to make this choice, if family has been for you what the word promises, then understanding this matters too. Because the person sitting next to you who goes quiet when families are mentioned is not cold. They are carrying something. And the most generous thing you can offer is not advice. It is the willingness to sit with their silence and trust that it holds a story you may never fully understand, but that deserves to be respected rather than corrected. If this gave words to something you have been holding without language, you are not alone in it. This channel is a space for the psychological experiences that most people feel, but the world rarely names. If this meant something to you, consider subscribing so these conversations continue. And if you are willing, leave something in the comments. Not your whole story if that feels like too much. Just enough to let someone else know that they are not the only one who made this choice and survived it. Thank you for watching.